Hello my friends, welcome to my corner. A couple of weeks ago I finally finished reading a novel that I had meant to read for a very long time. I picked up from the shelf Pinocchio by Carlo Collodi and finally decided to read it. I have not seen the Disney film that everybody has seen as an adult, so for some reason I think back on that movie and I remember it as a very dark film, a very sad and depressing story, and really I have no idea why, because I know that there are happy scenes in the movie and I also remember, I think, that it had a happy ending, but for some reason what stands out for me from that film are all the sad scenes, all the scenes in which Pinocchio is being, humiliated and punished for his acts. And I think this is not really a strange thing, because when you think about it, the message of this film, or the purpose, is to teach young children to be obedient and also not to give in to their low impulses or to peer pressure and all those things, right? So it makes sense that I remember it as a dark movie. Now, when I read the novel, I realized that the story is much more complex than it seems, or much more complex than it would seem to somebody who is judging the text based on the Disney movie, which is, I think, what happens to most of us, because most of us experience Pinocchio first as a film, as an animated film, and then as a novel, if we read the novel at all. So I wanted to share with you my impressions on this novel and to urge you to read it, because it's a novel that really has a lot to offer. Even the message is much more complex than it seems if you have the movie in mind. So, Pinocchio, The Adventures of Pinocchio, text by Carlo Collodi from the year 1883. It's a text that really does not need a whole lot when it comes to introduction, right? Most people know the story. Basically what you have is the story of a kind woodcarver who decides to make a puppet, and then that puppet comes alive only to start misbehaving and to be punished for his actions, right? So immediately when I think of this story of a man coming up with a puppet, and which then comes to life, right? The idea is to create something that has life. I immediately think, of course, of Frankenstein, right? The novel by Mary Shelley. And also, if you want to look back a little bit more to a completely different story here, I thought of the myth of Pygmalion, right? This sculptor who creates this perfect woman. And so many, completely different story, of course, but to give you an idea of what I was thinking about as I read the novel of this puppet coming to life. One thing that people say when it comes to Pinocchio is that they cannot stand the character because he's a brat and he's always misbehaving, etc. I don't think Pinocchio, the character, is necessarily a bad person, if you want to call him that at this point. He's simply human. That's the way he seems to me. He's simply human, maybe even more human than he realizes, because all that happens to him is that he is constantly being exposed to temptation, right? And it comes from many different sides, right? And the things that are being offered to him are very different too. For instance, the marionette theater offers him entertainment, right? Then he is also offered fortune, money, right? A life of leisure in the land of toys. So many things. So you have that on the one hand. On the other hand, you have the so-called real world offering nothing but toil and trouble. So can you really blame Pinocchio for acting or for making the choices that he makes? I don't think so. He is simply a human being. He has this tendency to give in to temptation, especially when he's being tempted with such wonderful things like, entertainment, fortune, leisure, etc. So Pinocchio is presented to us in the novel as a puppet in the literal sense and also in the metaphorical sense. He gives in to temptation and he is very easy to manipulate by all these people and all these characters around him because he has no willpower, or he has very little willpower, let's put it that way, at the beginning of the novel. You have the talking cricket, which acts, of course, as a kind of a voice of conscience, the voice of conscience that tells him, you should not do this, you should stay on the path, etc., etc. But this voice of conscience is external at the beginning of the novel. The novel is going to trace the journey that goes from being a puppet to being a complete, whole human being. And this journey is complete only when that voice of reason, that voice of conscience, is internalized, or maybe you could say even developed by the human being, when the human being can make the decisions on his own, right? And that is the journey that The Adventures of Pinocchio traces. So how does this happen in the novel and in the movie too? It happens through the aid of the fairy and also of the cricket. That's why by the end of the story, they disappear, right? They exit the scene a little bit early, because then they're not needed anymore. Once Pinocchio has become human, once he has actually, internalized or developed this voice of conscience, he does not need their aid anymore, and that's where the story ends. These characters are no longer necessary when it comes to that. Now, I think I chose an interesting way to describe Pinocchio, or try to choose something interesting just to give something different than the usual thing when it comes to this novel. And the way that I would describe it is as a bildungsroman for children. Okay, Bildung means formation or education in German. I understand those are some of the concepts that can be covered by this word. But if you think about it, Bildung sounds very similar to our word in English, building. It's the story of a human being that is being built, right? And you can think of all the Bildungsromans that you know, and this is what happens, right? We are presented with a character and his or her development. Most of the time his, but you also have other options when it comes to this. Now, what the novel is suggesting is that if you do not have a conscience, you do not have this sense of individuality, you are not truly free. So this is not only a novel of formation, it is also a novel that investigates or explores the true meaning of freedom. This is a timeless issue, right? Because peer pressure, for instance, is something that still exists in our society, and not only among children, but also, unfortunately, among many adults too. Think of the people you know. How many people do you know who can claim to think and to act freely? Completely freely. This is not a very common thing. We think, oh, somebody turns 21, okay, they're adults, that's fine. They live by themselves, they're adults. That's not really the way it works. Freedom is much more than that. Those are just outward forms that sometimes, have to be adopted. But when it comes to the meaning of freedom, you have to look for something a little bit deeper. And it has to do, I think, mostly with thinking and then acting freely. When does Pinocchio become human? He becomes human when he is able to think freely and also to weigh the consequences of his actions. This, the novel is saying, Collodi is saying in the novel, this is the true meaning of freedom. Now, there are two other elements that are very important too. One of them is work, right? The novel really stresses the importance of work. Another one is self-sacrifice. Pinocchio also shows that he is completely human and has feelings of his own when he is able to sacrifice himself for Geppetto. So these two elements are also very important, and you can make a connection here. You could even say that Pinocchio, The Adventures of Pinocchio, is actually, in a way, or in more ways than one, an existentialist novel, because it stresses these ideas that were very dear to the existentialists. Now, one thing to keep in mind when it comes to this novel supposedly for children, right? It really shows you the human condition in all its harshness and in all its fragility. Poverty, for instance, is something that is present throughout the novel. You see it in Geppetto. Danger is always around the corner. These are realities that are always present to Pinocchio and the other characters too. We have to keep in mind that when this novel appeared, and remember that this is 1883, so at this point the literary movement that was en vogue in Italy was verismo. And verismo is another way of saying realism. This movement that stressed or emphasized the harsh realities of the world. The main authors associated with this movement, the most important one was Giovanni Verga, but also Grazia Deledda, who won the Nobel Prize for Literature in the 1920s, if I remember correctly, was also associated with verismo. So we have this idea, this desire to depict reality in all its harshness and all its realism. Some people would say in maybe a little bit of a pessimistic way. It really depends on your approach. But it's also, remember that neo-realism was a movement that was born in Italy much later on, or not much later, but a few decades later. It's not a coincidence, right? We have to keep in mind this tendency to depict reality as it is. There is also an element of satire in Pinocchio. You have, for instance, a satire of physicians with the characters of the crow and the owl, right? The crow and the owl, they have conflicting diagnoses when they visit Pinocchio. So you have a satire there of physicians. One says, yeah, he's fine. The other one says, no, he's gonna die. And you have this idea, right? You consult 2 doctors, 3 doctors, and you get a different opinion. That's why we do that, right? And also you have a satire of the justice system. When Pinocchio goes to the judge is a gorilla, and he condemns Pinocchio when he says he is innocent, or when he is proven to be innocent, and he sets him free when Pinocchio says, actually, I'm a thief. Right, so everything is upside down. You have this satire of these 2 very important parts of society. Now, even when you take into consideration all of these things, poverty, danger, the brutal nature of the world, and all of these institutions, right, like the justice system, education, doctors, that are pretty much corrupt, even then, Pinocchio wants to be human. So this is a life-affirming novel. It's an existentialist novel too, as I was saying before. Even though you have all these difficulties, human life, right, the human condition is still worth living. And that is a wonderful thing about the adventures of Pinocchio. I was reminded, of course, of Steven Spielberg's film AI, Artificial Intelligence. That is a clear meta text for Pinocchio. The filmmakers even talk about this in interviews and things like that. So it's not a secret. I'm not revealing anything here. And also, remember Blade Runner 2049? We have these androids who want to be human, you know? The holographic character Joy, at one point she says something like, she says to Kay, I wish I could die for you like a real girl. She says this like a real girl. So stories that reaffirm the value of life and of the human condition from an existentialist viewpoint. If you want to check out a good film version of Pinocchio, there is, of course, the Disney version that will give you Disney's interpretation of it. But then there's the 2019 film adaptation by Matteo Garrone, who also gave us, if you remember, a version, or yes, an adaptation of some of the tales of Giambattista Basile from The Tale of Tales. This is a wonderful film. 2015, I think, was the year that Tale of Tales came out. The adaptation of Pinocchio is from 2019, so only a couple of years ago. And it stars, of course, Roberto Benigni, wonderful. His performance as Geppetto, of course, is just fantastic because he covers so much ground with it. He is hilarious, he is heartbreaking, and he is also lovable, so it's hard to encompass this character. Geppetto is a very complex character, and Roberto Benigni just does the job wonderfully. He was very well chosen, very well cast in this movie. The movie is a visual treat. I mean, visually stunning and also true to the text. I read some of the reviews online, and even if you look at the rating that it has on imdb.com, the rating really does not do justice to the movie. I thought it was so much above that rating when I saw it. Some people complained, for instance, that the visuals were a little bit too bizarre, that the atmosphere was dark. And yes, this is exactly the way that I would describe the film, but this is also the way the text is. So the film, whether you like it or not, depending on whether you're coming from the Disney version or from other versions that you have seen of it, it really does reflect the text. So that is something that we have to say here. Next year, 2022, we can expect 2 adaptations. So we have a lot coming our way here, and it's going to be wonderful to see what next year brings. There is coming up an adaptation by Guillermo del Toro. So, I said it all, it's going to be something to look out for. And then for Disney, an adaptation by Robert Zemeckis. So, we'll see how they choose to adapt this film, keeping in mind the Disney version and the film version by Matteo Garrone that came out in 2019. So the bottom line here, I believe that The Adventures of Pinocchio is a relevant, unforgettable, and just highly enjoyable novel. I truly recommend that you read this book. You know the story already, okay, but even so, just give the book a chance and you will see that it has a lot to offer. When I read it a couple of weeks ago, as I said, I couldn't help thinking at the end, I wish I had read this before. It was sitting on my bookshelf for years, and I know that I keep saying this in my videos, but it's just the truth. I mean, I have so many books that have been sitting on shelves for years, and then when I finally read them, sometimes I am disappointed because, you know, I've been waiting and building all this expectation for so long, and then other times I am just amazed, and this is one of those cases. So I do wish I had given it a chance earlier. But then, you know, I really believe that there are some books that come to us at the exact moment of our lives that we are ready for them, when we just need them. You know, there are other books that you read and you're like, huh, I'm not really enjoying this. Well, maybe it's not the right moment, you know? And I think Pinocchio came to me just at the moment when I was ready to read it and when I needed to read it. So, do you have any comments, questions, recommendations, recipes, anything? Just let me know. And I'm always happy to receive, above all, recommendations, because I can always use some, you know, new ideas for things to read and to comment on if that is, you know, worth the time. I hope you enjoyed this video, my 2 cents on Carlo Collodi's novel, The Adventures of Pinocchio. Thank you so much for stopping by, and have a wonderful day.